Hi everyone. For this lecture, we are going to pivot away from experimental methods. I know we've been in the experimental method realm for quite a long time, but we're going to talk about a slightly different approach to examining questions in media psychology and look at both traditional survey methods and a more advanced kind of survey method known as experience sampling methods. So we're going to look at how both of these approaches can be used to help us answer questions in media psychology, and what are some of the pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages of each approach. To recap kind of where we've been so far this semester, we have talked about randomized lab experiments and noted that they're pretty great, especially when they're well designed to have strong internal validity. But as we've noted, they often really struggle with external validity. Field experiments can be really great, again, with external validity, but are often going to struggle with internal validity because when we've moved out into the field, we lose control over a lot of the things that we tend to have control over in the lab experiment setting. And natural experiments are really great, but in general, we can't just simply wait for the right opportunity to arise to test questions that we might be interested in testing. We can't just wait for the right conditions to emerge out in the world that we can sort of exploit for the purpose of a study. We'd really like to still have some agency over the kinds of research questions we're asking and answering. And so what we really need to find are some other tools that we can use to try and capture real world experiences as they're naturalistically occurring. So in some ways, trying to still take the benefits of those natural experiments without necessarily having to wait for those natural experiments to arise or require us to really intervene in the kind of involved ways that we've been looking at in lab and field experiments. So the first approach that we'll talk about is the traditional survey. So when we're thinking about a survey, which I'm sure many of you have likely completed at some point in your life, we're thinking about this kind of the simplest version of a survey that we might design, which is where we have a questionnaire, we ask some people to fill out our questionnaire, usually just one point in time, and they're often reflecting on the past, something they've done sometime previously, maybe even really far into the past. So we might be asking them about stuff that happened years and years ago. We might be asking them about stuff that happened months ago. We might be asking them about stuff that happened yesterday, or even maybe asking about stuff that happened today. So usually recollecting things that have happened sometime in the near or distant past. The issue with this approach, as you can probably imagine, and as you might have experienced if you have taken surveys at any point in your life, is that these are really subject to what we call recall biases, which are simply just the fact that people are often really bad at remembering what they did, what other people have done, for how long they did it, and how they felt. So any aspect of remembering that you think could go wrong, people are sometimes going to get it wrong. So they're either going to forget these things, they're not going to remember what they did, what others did, how long, how they felt. They're going to maybe misreport or just misremember, or maybe fear that they don't want to tell you the truth, and so they're actually going to just outright lie to you about the things that they had done. Let's look at just a quick example of what this could look like. So let's imagine that I'm giving out a traditional survey questionnaire, and as part of that questionnaire, I'm interested in how often people use TikTok. So my independent variable in this case being TikTok. So I might say, over the past month, how often have you spent on TikTok on a typical weekday? And I might want to see what you say. What do you estimate? How often would you say you spend on TikTok on a typical weekday? But you can imagine this is kind of a tricky question. If you think over the past month, you could imagine, well, my days have varied quite a bit on how often I use TikTok. On weekends, maybe I'm using it more. On weekdays, I'm using it quite a lot. But maybe I have classes on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and not on Thursday, Friday. So even within those weekdays, maybe there's a lot of variation in how often you're accessing it. And when you think about something like using TikTok, you can imagine you're often likely using it in very short bursts of time. It might be 30 seconds here, 2 minutes here, 5 minutes there, 20 minutes there. And so over the course of a day and over the course of multiple days, it might be hard to kind of add up and create just a kind of an overall average estimate of how often you're actually accessing this platform without some kind of objective data maybe to use to back it up. So this kind of question that's asking you to think of, one, a difficult experience to sort of summarize in your head, and then two, to kind of average across many, many different kinds of days in which you're trying to answer this question. And maybe my dependent variable is something like mood. So I might say, over the past month, how have you felt in general? Really sad, somewhat happy, really happy. And I could give you these response options and you get to pick. But you might say, well, my mood has changed quite a lot over the past month. It's sort of hard to say on average how I felt over the past month, because maybe you've had some really happy days, some really sad days, some in-between days. And so you're just not quite sure how to answer this question. So in both cases, you might just struggle to answer these questions because they're hard things to remember. They're hard things to estimate. And when it comes to something like how have you felt over the past month, you might experience some recall biases in which maybe it's easier to remember some good things that happened to you or easier to remember some really bad things that have happened to you. And so those things are the first that come to mind, which then kind of bias you towards saying really happy or really sad or something like that, rather than sort of some average across all of these days that you could think of. And we could try to address that in a survey by making these questions a little narrower, potentially a little easier to answer. So we could maybe alter our TikTok question to say, hey, how often did you spend on TikTok yesterday? Give me an estimate. You can imagine this is easier to answer in some ways, and that, okay, I'm no longer having to think about like a typical weekday over an entire month and like what was the difference across all those weekdays and in what ways did I use TikTok. But still, even when we're thinking, as I mentioned before, about something kind of complicated like TikTok, it's like, okay, I remember I used it kind of in 2-minute spans over many, many different segments of the day, but I don't quite remember how many 2-minute spans there were. And were they all 2 minutes or were some 5 minutes, and so forth and so forth. So a lot of questions you could still be asking, a lot of uncertainty that might still be built into answering this kind of question. And then similarly, you can narrow the mood question and say, well, how did you feel yesterday? Really sad, somewhat happy, really happy. This might be a bit easier to answer. You could probably recall this pretty well, at least more easily than you might estimate over the course of an entire month. And what I'm going to do with a traditional survey is try to examine what the relationship is between my variables of interest. So regardless of how I've decided to measure TikTok use or how I've decided to measure mood, I'm going to want to try and figure out what the relationship between these variables are across everybody who's now taken my survey. So what we're often going to do with these results is create what's called a scatter plot, which is going to show where everybody in my study kind of falls on these two dimensions. So I'm going to have an x-axis that shows me where everybody fell on TikTok use. And then I'm going to have a y-axis that shows me where everybody follows on mood. And each individual participant is basically going to be a point on my scatter plot. So this first participant, this red dot you can see at the top, had a relatively low level of TikTok use and a relatively high level of mood. So they were pretty happy. The second participant, represented by the second dot, shows that they had a relatively high amount of TikTok use and a relatively low amount of mood. And basically, each participant in my study is going to be represented as some kind of dot on this scatter plot. And I'm going to get this kind of messy looking figure that just shows a scatter of little dots, so a scatter plot. And what I'll want to do for my analysis is try to see, can I see across all these points on my scatter plot some systematic kind of relationship between this x variable and the y variable that I'm interested in, between TikTok use and between mood. And so I'll talk through what that kind of analysis looks like. When we're examining the relationship between an x and a y variable measured via survey, we're going to have what's called a correlation. So you've probably heard this term before. It's not one that we've mentioned much this semester because we've been dealing mostly with experimental methods. But when we do a survey, we're generally going to be working in the world of correlations. And what a correlation asks and what it examines is, are changes in one variable linked to changes in another variable? And it means, is there a kind of systematic linkage between these things, that we can see the higher you score on one variable, the higher or lower you tend to score on another variable. These are going to be represented in papers that we're going to be reading in the next few weeks as a correlation coefficient. It's either going to be this lowercase italicized r or this Greek letter beta, which is called a beta coefficient. You don't have to really worry too much about where those letters come from, but just know that they're representing a correlation coefficient. And the interpretation of these values is pretty similar. There are some differences between them, but for the purpose of this class, I don't need you to worry about that. I just need you to know, hey, it's a correlation coefficient. Both of these values are going to range from -1 to 1. And so when I'm interpreting a correlation coefficient, this value, this number of this range between -1 to 1 is going to tell us about the direction and the strength of a relationship between the variables of interest. So in this case, the relationship between TikTok use and mood. And so we visually represent those using scatter plots, where we're plotting the point of each XY coordinate on the plane. But then we're also going to look at what we call the line of best fit. So basically, what is the line that best represents the scatter of points that I have on this plot, which is exactly the kind of lines maybe you were looking at all through like middle school and high school when you're plotting like y equals mx plus b. That's exactly what we're doing here. We're seeing what line best kind of represents the relationship between these variables here. So when we're interpreting the correlation coefficient, we could have a positive coefficient, and what that would mean is that change in one variable predicts change in the same direction for the other variable. So this could mean either that an increase in your independent variable is associated with an increase in the dependent variable, or the inverse of this, a decrease in the independent variable is associated with a decrease in the dependent variable. The important thing is that they're both moving and changing and linked in the same direction. They're both going up with one another, or they're both going down with one another. A negative correlation is just the opposite. That's going to say that change in one variable predicts change in the opposite direction for the other variable. Change in the IV predicts change in the opposite direction for the DV. In other words, an increase in the IV is associated with a decrease in the dependent variable. Or the opposite, a decrease in the independent variable is associated with an increase in the dependent variable. Again, the important thing being that these variables are linked, but they're linked in opposite directions. As one goes up, the other goes down, or as one goes down, the other goes up. And so that's all that this symbol of the direction of the relationship is going to show us. Sorry, I did not put that up, but here you go. Increase in the IV associated with decrease, decrease associated with an increase. When we look at this in terms of a scatter plot, these images are just showing you what different kinds of correlations would look like, ranging from really strong correlations near +1 or near -1, or really lack of a relationship when we have r equals 0, and then these kind of values that come in between. And what you can see is that both the slope of the line is telling us what direction these variables are, in what way are these variables related to one another. So we see when the slope is pointing upward, we're seeing a positive relationship, that as scores on x go up, scores on y also go up. And when we see this downward sloping trend, that means that as scores on x go up, scores on y go down. So the slope is just telling us, it's visually representing that positive or negative direction. And then we can see the strength actually has to do with how clustered these dots are around the line. So in essence, how well is this line describing all of the dots that we have in our figure? Or is it really just a kind of random smattering of points where no line is actually kind of giving us any information about how those variables are related? You don't really have to worry too much about this for the purposes of this class. I just want you to kind of have a vague sense of what correlations are looking at. So that when we start interpreting them, you kind of have a sense of what does that mean in practice. Like I want you to have in your head, okay, I'm thinking of a scatter plot. I'm thinking of a line that's representing the relationship between these variables, and how well does that line kind of capture the scatter of plots that we have in this figure. So when I run or conduct a traditional survey study, I'm going to have what we call between subjects comparisons. So when I run correlations, I'm actually comparing the relationship that I'm seeing between different participants. So in the same way that experiments in some versions, we're comparing subjects between one another at values of this level with those at values of another level, the correlations are doing something very similar. When I have a traditional survey, I'm seeing participants who tend to score high on this variable, do they also tend to score higher on this other variable than those who score lower on either one? So let me put that into an example into more concrete terms for you. So let's say I conduct a study on TikTok use and mood, and I find a correlation in my traditional survey of r equals 0.27. My correlation equals 0.27. that relationship is positive and it's greater than 0. So it's not super, super strong. It's not near 1. We're rarely going to have correlations that strong in the social sciences. But this would tell me, if I were to rephrase it into words, that people who use more TikTok relative to those who use less TikTok also tend to report higher mood. So people who use TikTok more often also tend to report higher mood than those who use TikTok less often. The important thing here is that I'm comparing between subjects. I'm looking at those who tend to use TikTok more, comparing them to those who use TikTok less, and seeing if I see systematic differences in mood as well. So again, it's taking the same logic of the experimental design and saying, okay, we have these different groups of people who differ on this variable of interest. Do we also see that they tend to differ on this other variable of interest? Similarly, if I'd run a study, maybe a different study, and I had looked at this relationship between TikTok and mood, say I had a beta coefficient equals negative 0.45, just for the sake of illustration, what this would mean in words is that people who use TikTok more often also tend to report lower mood than those who use TikTok less often. And that's because of this negative symbol here. We're now seeing these relationships move in different directions, whereas with the positive symbol, they were moving in the same direction. So when R equals positive 0.27, we see that as TikTok use goes up, mood tends to also go up. Alternatively, if we had a beta coefficient or an R coefficient, whatever, equals negative 0.45, that would mean that these variables are moving in opposite directions. As TikTok use goes up, mood tends to go down. And that's what we mean when we have these between subjects comparisons. We're looking at those who tend to score high on one variable and comparing them to those who tend to score less on that variable. But there are several limitations with this approach. One is one we've already talked about, is that people might just be really bad at remembering these things, and they might be systematically bad at that. So the reason that they might over-report TikTok use might also lead to over-report of mood or under-report in either case, whatever it might be. But more importantly, kind of adopting this experimental logic is that we have not randomly assigned people to more or less TikTok use. They have self-selected into that some people are just naturalistically using TikTok more, and some of them are just naturalistically using TikTok less. So because we haven't randomly assigned these groups of people, there could be pre-existing differences that are actually explaining these differences in mood that have nothing to do with TikTok. And so we're going to have a lot of potential alternative explanations for this relationship we see in a traditional survey design. So are these group differences a function of differences in TikTok use or some other cause? And ideally, if we can't resolve this by doing, an experimental study, we would like a survey method that maybe is able to get us a little more precision here and a little more confidence or a little more certainty about these relationships that we're looking at. And so that'll bring us to what we call an experience sampling method, which is a specific type of survey that's an intensive and longitudinal survey where participants are reporting their thoughts, their feelings, or their behaviors multiple times per day, typically in real time as those things are occurring. So I'm no longer just surveying people one time. I'm no longer kind of asking them to reflect on a long time ago. What I'm doing in this kind of study is repeatedly surveying people over the course of a day and asking them to reflect on experiences either right after they occur or actually as those experiences are unfolding. So it's going to give us a bit of a narrower picture of how these things are unfolding in everyday life and kind of resolve some of these issues that we were seeing in a traditional survey design. So in a typical experience sampling study, the way you're going to know that you're dealing with an experience sampling study is that participants are going to be filling out multiple questionnaires rather than just one. So this is going to unfold as a longitudinal study over time rather than a cross-sectional study, which is only one time. And it's going to be intensive and repeated. So it's going to kind of repeat multiple times per day, sometimes 4 times, 5 times, 6 times per day. And these surveys are being filled out in daily life. So it's not just like one time you're kind of coming up and talking to a researcher and filling out a survey, but you're actually getting prompted throughout your kind of course of your everyday life to open up this survey, answer some questions, and then go on with your everyday life. So we'll look at some examples of that. But what that means is that we have to have different kinds of survey triggers. So there needs to be some kind of rhyme or reason to when we're asking you to fill out these surveys, or kind of how you're being prompted to fill out these surveys. It could be random, so it could just be that I'm going to give you 6 surveys each day, and you're going to randomly get those surveys between the hours of 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. And so I'm just going to have it randomly trigger and send you these surveys. That's a little less common than what we call these interval or event-based approaches. The interval-based approach would just be every 1 hour or every 3 hours from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. you're going to fill out a survey. And so there's some kind of regular expectation to when you're going to be prompted to do that. But even potentially more useful are these event-based ones. So I can actually kind of program an application to prompt you with surveys every time that you're engaging in some kind of behavior that's of interest to me. So for example, every time you close out of TikTok, I might prompt you with a survey. Or every time you walk away from campus, I might prompt you with a survey. Or every time you open your music listening app, I might prompt you with a survey. So I can actually identify these moments that I'm interested in capturing for whatever reason, and actually prompt you with a survey in those moments and kind of see what's going on. So as an example, I might do an interval-based study where I'm going to prompt you with 3 surveys, one at 10 a.m., one at 2 p.m., one at 6 p.m. And so basically every 4 hours, I'm going to give you a survey. And I might give you some really simple questions. I might say, hey, right now, are you using TikTok? Yes or no? And then right now, how are you feeling on a scale of 1 to 5, being really bad to really good? You might notice, relative to the questions I was asking before, these are pretty simple, brief, straightforward questions. So because I'm surveying you quite a lot, I don't want to ask you really involved, really difficult questions. I just want to try and capture the most important things in that moment that I'm interested in capturing. So right now, you're using TikTok. Right now, how are you feeling? Event-based could be another approach here where I'm actually going to look at every time you close TikTok. And in this case, I might not actually have to ask you any questions about your TikTok use if I'm automatically recording how long each of those sessions are. So I might be able to set up my app in some way that I don't need you to tell me how long you were using TikTok. I'm just going to have your phone objectively record it, and then it's going to collect that data every time you close out of the app. And each time you do that, I'm going to prompt you with a survey, and you're just going to tell me how you're feeling. So I don't even need you to reflect on your TikTok use whatsoever. I just need you to know how you feel, and I'm going to look at how that relates to your objectively kind of captured TikTok use. The cool thing about this approach is that I'm no longer relegated or required to just compare you with other people. I can actually compare you to yourself over time. So this is the same logic, or a similar logic that we were seeing in experimental design, where we could assign people to this group or that group. Or we can have a within subjects design, where we're comparing you to yourself over time under different conditions. And so in this case, when I run an experience sampling study, the correlations that I calculate are going to reflect these within-person comparisons rather than just these between-person comparisons. And that leads to slightly different interpretations, because now my independent variable is going to reflect something like times where I'm using TikTok versus times when I'm not using TikTok, and what is my mood across these different scenarios. So you can imagine a world where I've surveyed you 4 times a day using these kind of interval-based triggers every 2 hours. I find out yes or no whether or not you're using social media, and I get a measure of your mood under all of these different conditions. And so no longer do I have to compare you when you're using TikTok to others when they're not using TikTok. I can compare you to yourself and see how you vary under these different conditions. How are you feeling in general when you're not using TikTok? How are you feeling in general when you are using TikTok? And do we see kind of systematic within subject variation in those comparisons? So when I have these within subjects comparisons, I might look at times you used TikTok versus times you didn't, and look at are there differences in mood, and I might get a similar correlation that I saw before. In this case, I might get an R of 0.27. But this is going to mean something slightly different than we had before, because we're no longer looking at between subjects comparisons, we're looking at within subjects comparisons. So now what this would mean, I have a positive correlation, 0.27, is that in moments when people use TikTok, they also tend to report higher mood. So I'm looking at kind of how I change over time under different circumstances. So in moments when people are using TikTok, they also tend to report higher mood. So looking at this within subject comparison here. And the beta coefficient, same one from before. Maybe I run this study and I get a negative 0.45, just meaning these variables are going in opposite directions. And this would mean that in moments when people use TikTok, they tend to report lower mood. Alternatively, when people are not using TikTok, they tend to report higher mood. Could be another way of phrasing this. So again, the benefit here is that I'm comparing you to yourself under different conditions and seeing what that looks like across a large sample of people, rather than just looking at this sample that I've surveyed one time and making comparisons between people who are and aren't doing the thing of interest. The other cool thing is that because I have these repeated surveys intensively sampled over time, I can also look at directionality. So for example, I could look at whether or not your TikTok use today predicts your mood tomorrow, or the inverse of that, does your bad mood today predict your TikTok use tomorrow? So I can look at these things not only closely as they relate to in the particular moment of interest, but also how do we see these things unfold over time? And when you think back to when we've talked about causality, this can provide some useful evidence of temporal ordering, basically which change came first. Was it change in TikTok use or change in mood, predicting shifts in TikTok use or shifts in mood? And I'm going to get a better evidence of that in this kind of experience sampling study than I'll be able to get in a survey study. But in either case, it's still not going to be quite as good as I am going to have in that traditional experimental design. This approach of experience sampling is not going to rule out these alternative explanations as effectively as I can in an experiment. But there are some other advantages to be aware of. Those main advantages being that with this experience sampling approach, it's going to really help to reduce recall biases. So one, if I'm just asking you on something that's happening in that moment or as it unfolds or that just ended, you're going to have a much easier time recalling that thing than if I ask you days or weeks or months later. And I might also have, again, designed this study so that I don't even have to ask you about certain experiences. For example, if I'm objectively measuring your TikTok use, I don't have to ask you. I can just have your phone calculate that information for me and then relate that to surveys of your mood or well-being. And the other important thing to note is that media effects are really likely to occur in specific moments and specific situations that are kind of really unique to the way you're living your day-to-day life. And it might look different than the way media effects manifest in somebody else's life. And I might have trouble devising an experimental study that can kind of capture all that variation. But with an experience sampling method, I'm actually going to be able to capture those naturalistic differences in how these things manifest in day-to-day life. In moments when you're naturalistically self-selecting into using TikTok versus when you're naturalistically not using TikTok, I can capture that kind of uniqueness within you as an individual and capture it kind of differently in how it manifests in somebody else. And so this approach may be a better tool that I can use to look at how media use is really naturalistically happening in everyday life. But there are several disadvantages of this approach. One is that it might create demand characteristics, as we've noted before, threatening internal validity. The reason being that if I'm asking you the same set of questions many times in a row, in the same way that that would maybe bias what you're doing in an experimental setting, it may bias what you're doing over the course of this experience sampling study. You might change your behavior just because you guessed the purpose of the study. You might also realize, hey, I get these surveys every time I close out a TikTok. I'm just going to stop opening TikTok because I'm tired of filling out these surveys, which is not what we want. We want to capture your kind of naturalistic behavior. So we don't really want the way that we're prompting you to participate to actually change the nature of your behavior. So that's one thing to kind of watch out for. There's also some data issues that emerge. This is going to be really complex data. You can imagine if I've surveyed people if I have hundreds of surveys from the same participant and I have that across hundreds of participants, you're just dealing with lots of complex data. And you're also going to be dealing with lots of missing responses. So surveys that people skip or that they don't fill out or that they forget to fill out. For whatever reason, you're not going to have like perfect filled out surveys from every participant. There's going to be a lot of missing data, which statistically you have to kind of deal with in certain ways. These studies also tend to be expensive if we're keeping people in these studies for long periods of time and we're asking them to do kind of a burdensome task for multiple days of their lives. You got to be paying these people for the most part, and you got to be paying them enough to kind of make it worth their while. And then of course, there's just going to be less certainty about causality. Again, everything that we've moved on from lab experiments, we're losing control over what we have and how the IV is administered. As we've moved from the lab experiment to the field, as we've moved from the field to the natural experiment, and as we've moved from the natural experiment to here with experience sampling, looking at naturalistic behavior, we're just going to be less and less certain about what's really causing effects in our studies, what's really causing group differences in our studies. So there's downsides to that, but in this case, there's a lot of kind of high external validity then to what we're capturing. So your reading for this week is going to be a study that is really looking at these within-person patterns in a study of social media and well-being. And so I want you to take a look at the study, and I want you to particularly notice the different language they're using throughout the results, the method and results and discussion to describe between-person versus within-person correlations, because they're really making an important distinction between what we're able to learn and why studies might come to conflicting results based on what they find in between-person comparisons and what they find in within-person comparisons. And then again, as with all the other studies we've been reading in the second half of this class, I'm curious to find out if any of these results are surprising to you. So there we have it. So this lecture was really focusing in on traditional survey methods and what we can learn from both survey methods and experience sampling methods and the advantages and disadvantages of these approaches.